I meant what I said when I said that the government's heart is rotten to the core, and this includes the ministers. Because how else can you explain 14,000 plus people being left worse off as a result of a bill that will strip many low-income people from the accommodation supplement and the income-related rent subsidies? All for what? To pay for tax cuts for the wealthy few and the fossil fuel industry. Shame on this government. The minister thinks that voters are stupid because she completely omitted details of the bill that will increase hardship for people, that will leave people needing emergency housing, hardship grants, and other forms of temporary assistance. She did not mention this once. And all the while we've been trying to raise this issue to the government members, they've been laughing away because poverty is a laughing matter for members of the government. Shame on the government members who, through urgency as part of this legislation, have decided to throw thousands of families deeper into poverty to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy few. We deserve much better. The people in public housing who were living on the streets and in emergency housing deserve better. We need a government that is committed to taxing the wealthy few fairly so that we can have thriving public services, not a government that is slashing and burning our public services, making the lowest income workers pay for the tax cuts, including some of our lowest paid women and some of the most undervalued professions. And if you don't believe me about the impacts of this bill, you just got to look at the analysis made by the government ministry that talks about the disproportionate impacts that this bill will have, about how Maori, disabled, the old will be paying a disproportionate price in this bill. They will be left reeling because on average, people will be paying over $100 much more each week as a result of this bill. This shows that this government is deeply unserious about addressing the cost of living crisis because none of them have dared in their contributions to face up to the fact that this bill, as explained by the government's own analysis, will leave accommodation supplement receivers paying $100 on average extra each week. All the while, people in social housing affected by this bill will be on average paying an extra $132 a week extra. That is the difference between people being able to put food on the table and pay their bills. But they seem to be completely out of touch. And for all the performative outrage for people like Joseph Mooney, who talks about having lived poverty, clearly he decided to turn his back on the very same people he claimed to represent and belong to. So easy to do when you spend hours and hours on the Coda Lounge talking to people who simply are not reflected on the bill that is literally criminalizing people in poverty, because the advice on this bill has told us that this bill will literally criminalize people because it will encourage people to have to lie about who they have as boarders in their house, and that in and of itself could lead to fraud investigations and literally people being burdened with tens of thousands of dollars in debt or literally facing prison time. Shame on this government for pushing through a bill that does nothing but increase poverty, nothing but increase inequality, nothing but disproportionately affect Maori, the disabled, Pacifica, and the working poor. This government has completely described this bill factually incorrect, either by choice or because they chose to not read the bill, because I haven't seen any of them honor the communities that will be disproportionately impacted by this. None of them. They talked about fairness. Fairness to them seemed to be giving more money to the wealthy CEOs and then leaving over 14,000 people way worse off. $100 less each week may not mean much for the privileged members on the other side, but it is literally a lifeline that is lost for families and public housing. But this is all part of the plan of the government members to drive people away from public housing and onto the streets, to undermine our public housing stock. Because we've seen how the government as well is building less public housing. We've seen how the government is investing less on the very few supports that still exist for homeless people, and yet is completely happy to drive people away from their homes and onto the streets without then creating a lifeline. It would have been fair if the government had said, we're making changes to how people who have borders can access the accommodation supplement and the income-related subsidy if they had introduced an alternative. But there is none. So that means that on average, this government is leaving those families paying an extra $100 to $130 plus on average each week. And in fact, if you have 3 borders, the difference now will be over $200. We've got to remember the history of why we had a bit of reprieve for people who had at least 2 borders in their home. And that is because historically, over 30 years ago, it was acknowledged that because of the neoliberal reforms of the 80s, that meant that public housing tenants could be left paying market rent, that we needed to support people like sole parents who often were living in public housing without other people with them, therefore paying additional costs and without the support systems. This is why we had that reprieve for people with at least 1 to 2 borders. It was to support them, and the rug has been pulled under them. All for what? To give more money to the tobacco industry, to the fossil fuel industry, to the mining industry. Shame on this government for pushing through these changes or for the complete inability to address the harms that this bill will create. Not a single one of them have talked about the communities who this bill will be affecting. They've been so much busy posting on Instagram about the performative work because for them, and many of them, particularly the list MPs from the government side, the one job is to heckle, the one job is to create, speeches made by ChatGPT instead of engaging with the communities that they are harming. I think our communities deserve far better than this. This bill, as I've spoken to, will create negative material impacts on people and the front line. They don't even seem to care about the MSD staffers who will now be in charge of administering this bill. They don't seem to care about the MSD staffers, Mr. Speaker, because the advice from MSD themselves talked about how this bill will increase friction at the MSD offices. It could literally put MSD staffers at risk because of that increased friction. So they do all this performative outrage, when there's a lockdown of the MSD offices about how much they care for the safety of MSD staffers. But then they're quite happy to rush through pieces of legislation that literally increases friction of the MSD offices. And I wish all the outrage and heckles on the other side would be about the poverty that this bill is creating. But it is an outrage driven by the fact that they seem to be offended by the fact that this bill is increasing poverty. I wish they were outraged about poverty. I wish they were outraged about inequality, Mr. Speaker. I wish they were outraged about the cost of living crisis. But instead, all we get is performative outrage. And when it comes to the communities that they're harming, they turn their faces back away from the streets and onto this echo chamber, and instead they would rather create imaginary characters in their head, beneficiaries, as Nicola Willis has described, playing PlayStation all day, when she has not taken her time to, for example, meet with people on the benefit who have been negatively affected by this government's actions, including the bill in front of us. We could have heard from borders, from people who have borders, from low-income public housing tenants in a select committee stage period, but instead, they decided to introduce this bill under urgency, even though they knew that they were going to do this more than a year ago. So they decided to do this more than a year ago, and yet they didn't honor the democratic process of actually putting this bill through adequate scrutiny, which shows that this government doesn't want to face the truth of thousands of people in public housing and on affordable rentals, telling them to their faces about how they will be left worse off. They are literally scared of facing the communities that they're harming. They're scared of being told that they're leaving people homeless. They're scared of being told that they are leaving people in debt. They're scared of being told that they're increasing hardship. They're scared of disabled people on the supported living payment, telling them that they're going to be facing additional barriers to simply keep a roof over their head. They're scared of the scrutiny they could have faced on this bill, so they would rather push it under urgency. Because this is a government scared of owning up to the voters that they have chosen to harm, that they have chosen to literally push to the streets, all for what? For the wealthy mates. We deserve a government that taxes the wealthy few and funds adequate public services so that we can have public housing for all, free ECE, free dental, and the things that our communities need to thrive. We will make sure this is a one-term government so that they cannot continue with this harm.